Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. When talking about reparations, we must never leave what's happened for the last 150 years out of the conversation, because it has been a direct continuation of all the laws, policies, and practices of the slavery era. We are in the condition we're in because this country's position regarding black people has always been that black people should build and sustain the nation's economy, but black people must never be allowed to benefit from the nation's economy. The purpose of government is supposed to be to enrich and improve the lives of the citizens, but where black people are concerned, government's sole purpose is to maintain a racial status quo, make black people poor and keep them poor, because a poor people are also a weak people, and weak people can never threaten those who oppress them. Now, whenever talking about the history of racial oppression against us, one thing the white supremacists always constantly try to hide behind is that many of the laws regarding black people always seem to be contradictory, especially the ones in the post-Emancipation Proclamation era. The white supremacists focus on the part that lends itself to their narrative that the country has always addressed racial equality in its laws, but they conveniently ignore the parts of the laws that show that this isn't true at all. And you see this from the white left as well as the white right. For example, the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, or at least that's what the white media, white right-wingers, and white liberals who want to pat themselves on the back for how progressive they think the country is want us to believe. The reality, however, is that the 13th Amendment has an enormous but in it. Slavery is still legal for state and federal governments. All the 13th Amendment did was to take slavery from being a private sector institution to being a public sector institution. Old John White, the plantation owner, can no longer have slaves, but Uncle Sam can, along with every racist sheriff and state penitentiary in the country, and that's exactly what they've done. All the laws regarding black people, specifically the ones pertaining to our rights, have loopholes of some sort written into them, either to allow any and everyone to take advantage of the laws meant to benefit us, or to nullify the laws altogether. From the so-called abolition of slavery to the Civil Rights Acts, this happens over and over again because this is what the white leadership of the country wants. This is the overarching policy that they must maintain. And how could it be any other way? You have laws written by the slave owners themselves in the 18th and 19th centuries, and laws written by the descendants of the slave owners ever since, all the way to the present. And in the case of the northern white supremacists, you have laws written by allies and apologists for slavery, like Joe Biden. So, of course, every law these dirtbags write is going to have some backdoor provision in it that makes the law worthless to black people. This is what Malcolm meant when he said that even the laws this country does bother to write are so fixed up and chopped up as to have no effect whatsoever. That's by design, and the pattern of the last 150 years shows it. Because we've had the white left congratulating themselves for all the progress the country has made, and the white right pretending to be outraged because black people have all these laws, etc. Now, both of them know that nothing has changed at all, but the truth is black people know it too. What's been missing is enough of us to say it and stand on it and not back down. But nowhere is the internal trickery more apparent than in how these so-called laws and programs are administered. For example, take the post-World War II period. World War II had been a huge economic driver for the U.S. economy, but with the war over, you had millions of GIs coming back home, and the U.S. government was trying to find a way to avoid the economic malaise of the 1920s and 30s. So the federal government had a raft of programs and money pumped into providing the returning white GIs with an education, homes, and businesses, all on the federal government's dime. Let's drill down on the housing piece for a moment, because the most important asset that any person owns is their home. Home equity is usually the most common way that wealth is passed from one generation to the next. So let's drill down on the housing piece. In 1940, the median home value in the U.S. was $2,938. Now, when Congress created the VA loan program in 1944, the maximum loan guarantee was $2,000, and the interest rates, about 4%. GIs who got those loans had a huge advantage because the loans were backed by the federal government, so lenders could afford to be generous with their interest rates. But of course, black GIs were completely shut out of these programs, deliberately. Combine that with the GI educational bill that allowed so many of those returning white GIs to get themselves a free college education, and also you had small business loans being prioritized for white GIs, and what you had was the white middle class being created out of whole cloth, entirely as an act of government policy, as were the slums and ghettos that the black GIs returned to. Now, white society tries to blame this on the racist politicians from the segregated South. After all, 70+% of black GIs came from the South, and while it's true that the racists there controlled the banks, it's also true that the federal government allowed people who they knew were die-hard racist to be able to control how all those federal funds were dispersed and to whom they were dispersed. Keep in mind, that's how Brett Favre was able to take money that was supposed to be for poor black Mississippians and instead divert it to pay for his daughter's volleyball stadium. Not to mention other activities and obligations that he allegedly didn't fulfill. Because the federal government is still allowing the racists to be given the federal money from these programs and allowing these racists to decide who gets it. They don't have to do that. The federal government chooses to do that. And this allows racist Democrats like Biden and Pelosi to falsely claim that why we allocated the money, it's those mean old Republicans who won't do right. Same way Biden claims that his '94 crime bill wasn't to blame for the orgy of mass incarceration that began in the mid-90s. He blames the states, but conveniently leaves out the key provision of the '94 crime bill, the so-called Truth in Sentencing Clause, that promises the states billions of dollars in federal funds if they change their laws to bring them in line with Biden's own draconian standards. So scapegoating the states for policies that white liberal politicians want is a time-honored tradition of the federal government. Ever since the storied 40 acres and a mule all the way up to Biden's phony baloney lift every voice plan, every single time this country was forced to make an economic promise to black people, it has always turned right around and broke that promise. Not because the money isn't there, but because this racist nation has a racial pecking order in place and will do whatever it takes to maintain it. Government resources are how the white community was given its position and how it is maintained. Neither the white middle class nor the suburbs' so-called white flight could possibly have happened without the federal government putting all of their money behind it. But what goes unsaid is that the black community was also made to be in a certain position too, through the targeted, planned, and deliberate deprivation of resources. But more than that, we've been subjected to a never-ending barrage of economic, physical, and political attacks. Black neighborhoods are constantly demolished by the cities and states using infrastructure as a weapon. Robert Moses, the legendary so-called urban planner, was the one who pioneered this racial technique in New York City. And this racist practice that Robert Moses pioneered of weaponizing infrastructure as a means of ethnic cleansing was duplicated and copied by cities and states all across this country. And by demolishing black enclaves, it prevents black neighborhoods from being able to find stability. It pushes black people around like cattle, making black people into nomads in their own homes. When black people try to get the startup capital to begin our own businesses, banks turn us down, not because our business plans aren't viable, but because the wrong color person came asking for a loan. And the few black people who do manage to get the funds come under perpetual attack by zoning boards who claim that black businesses have violated some ordinance or another. These aren't oversights or flaws in the system. This is the system. Always make sure to point out the continuity of policy, not just the laws written, but also how they're carried out, because you cannot separate the two. Slavery didn't happen in a vacuum. And when you mention the fact that the slave codes were replaced by the black codes, and the government did indeed continue the peculiar institution as it does to the present, you see that slavery changed only in form, but not in character. But there's also something else that hasn't changed in character either. Justice. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Lok Thies, Aisha Sarpong, Roxanne Allen, Rahman Muhammad, and Reasonable Dude. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.